This is Adventures in Bootleg, the show cataloguing my experiences with bootleg and off-brand products through history. This episode takes us back to March 2023, which is just over a year ago. A new shop opens up in Cambridge, and to my surprise it's coated wall to wall with bootleg products and schneid children's toys. At this point I was becoming a mega fan of the popular game series Poppy Playtime, but I was never able to get a plush of one of the main characters, Huggy, because of shipping costs from America. Imagine my surprise when I see literally 100 of these things coating the walls of this place. After I recovered from the absolute awe of such a massive and colourful collection, I noticed that only one of the Huggies out of all of them has a colour scheme that is accurate to the games. In this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're going to the cinema. In October of last year, the Five Nights at Freddy's movie came out and blew the community away. That same week, a picture began circulating of a movie called Freddy's Fridays with a poster that was suspiciously similar. It turns out that another company in America had given their debut movie a plot which was very similar to FNAF, given it a poster that looked suspiciously similar, and deliberately caused the release date to coincide with Five Nights at Freddy's. The movie currently stands at 0.5 out of 5 on Rotten Tomatoes. In this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're returning to the greatest bootleg shop in Cambridge. In episode 1, I went over a brand new shop that opened that sold a massive amount of bootleg merchandise. Around a month later, I returned to it to find how their stock had changed. It turns out that their collection had grown massively, including the addition of plushies hanging from the ceiling, like this incredibly unfortunate Minecraft Daddy Longlegs from Poppy Playtime that seems like they've had enough and they couldn't take any more. I also captured this poor grey Huggy with a loose eye, bless his heart. Do you remember this FNAF app from 2014 and 15? In this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're going to Google Play. This is an episode very close to my heart, and it starts with a question. Do you remember this FNAF app from 2014 and 15? It changed its name to ChatGum and has since shut down, but in the beginning it was known as FNAF Chat, and it was made to ride on the early FNAF hype when it began in the second half of 2014. The app contained tons of chat rooms, and weirdly, if you get the app today with an APK, which is the only way to access it, group chats are still being made, including groups surrounding Afghanistan and Palestine. I remember meeting legitimate FNAF fans on this app around 10 years ago, which is insane to me. Like I say though, the name since changed to ChatGum and the app has shut down, but you can still access the original FNAF Chat app with an APK. In this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're turning to these Five Nights at Freddy's trading cards that I found on a bootleg website a few years ago. I must have missed these when they came out because they're dated as 2016, and if that's to be believed, then this would have been one of the earliest examples of merchandise for the whole series, and it's believable to think that they would have been America only, but they made their way to the UK one way or another. I bought quite a few of these packs on multiple occasions, some of which are even in videos on this account. They really do bring you back to the early days of the franchise if the 2016 release date is to be believed. Some contain artwork from within the games themselves, some contain gold renders and you get one in at least every pack, but the majority of them are stolen fan art, which is why I chose them to be the focus of an episode in this series. I've heard conflicting arguments that these packs are somehow official, and this artwork was done by official artists commissioned by Scott Cawthon. To me, that chronology doesn't make any sense. If you go back to 2016, at that point Scott Cawthon was the only person working on these games. The artists to work on these are just non-existent or are unknown to this day. If that sounds a bit extreme, I've gone on several subreddits and websites over the years asking who exactly did the artwork for these packs, and nobody, I repeat, nobody knew where this art had come from, but at least one design has been found on DeviantArt. In this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're returning to Cambridge, but not to the shop that we've been to before. Believe it or not, within 5 minutes of walking distance from the shop that I mentioned in previous episodes, there is another shop that is selling bootleg products, but they're slightly more hidden in aisles away from the doors. These include Pokemon cards, Yu-Gi-Oh cards in Pokemon packaging, Sliding Plate 3, I don't even know where to begin talking about that, Dinosaur Fighter, Acousto-Optic Motorcycle, which is one of my favourites, and of course, Bounce Time Turtle. In this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're returning for a third time to the greatest bootleg shop in Cambridge. This time they've expanded even more, branching out into Poppy Playtime toys and this hilarious display box. This would have been around Christmas 2023, and looking back, it's the biggest and most impressive that the shop ever looked, which also means there was the highest volume of bootleg and off-brand items. The display box itself included fan renders which made it look hilarious, but it's also very scary. Particular highlights during this trip are Chota Beam, which I don't even know where to begin explaining, and the hilarious display box I mentioned before. They actually let me keep it. I've still got it, it's just at home. On this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're going on the first of many journeys to AliExpress. This episode is going to focus on 2 Poppy Playtime plushes which can be bought on AliExpress, worryingly, right now. Lunchboxy, based on a skin from the game Project Playtime, doesn't exist as an official plush both at the time that I bought the plush and at the time of recording. This means that bootleggers have built what you can see now from scratch. Long story short, it's my favourite plush ever. The detail, the crank for the music box, the size, and the incredibly short time it took to arrive from China all contribute to this. Regular Boxy is a bit smaller, but it's still very impressive because at the time that I bought it, there wasn't the official Boxy plush that we have now, which is incredibly expensive. The arms are weird and feel stringy, but other than that, it's an incredibly impressive pair of plushes. In this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're returning to AliExpress for another bootleg plush review. Nab Nab from Garten of Banban 2 and the Banban OC Scout Lenny. Both received bootleg plushes incredibly quickly, and I have no idea how they did it. At the time that I bought these, Banban 2 was under a month old, and yet both of their designs translate into plushes surprisingly really well. The only comment that I have are the teeth on Scout Lenny, which at the time I just thought was Nab Nab. No, they look really weird. Nab Nab on the other hand is incredibly accurate to the games. It's another 10 out of 10, it's an S tier plush, just like Lunchboxy. In this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're heading to Temu. Let me explain. Possessed Fredbear is one of 3 plushies made by Sanchi in 2015 to promote the launch of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. When I was young, I bought the other 2, Foxy and Freddy, but I missed out Possessed Fredbear. I think it was a bit more expensive. What I didn't know at the time was that Possessed Fredbear was a limited edition exclusive which can now cost hundreds of pounds. Ever since I realised that, I wanted to complete the trio of Sanchi plushes, and I've looked everywhere for a bootleg Possessed Fredbear plush. Weirdly, AliExpress, they had tons of the golden Freddy plush which looks incredibly similar, but there were no plushes with the purple top hat, which is what we were looking for. It wasn't until I made my first purchase on Temu that I was able to complete my decade-long search of finding a Possessed Fredbear plush. And I still have it with me, actually. Here it is. This book should not exist and is slowly disappearing forever. Let me explain. This is Survive the 5. It's a book made by someone either called Anna or using the name Anna. It's being sold at retail, sometimes up to £10, but FNAF is entirely copyrighted and this is not official. Sites are slowly clamping down on Survive the 5, and soon it will be impossible to buy anywhere. It's a guidebook riddled with errors like on this one page, but we'll get to that next time. In this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're looking deeper into Survive the 5, the unofficial FNAF guidebook which is slowly going extinct. One page I can read has 2 errors as far as I can count. It wrongly claims that Night 5 is Nightmare Freddy when they mean Nightmare Fredbear, and the plush in the picture isn't Golden Freddy, it's Fredbear. The pacing of the FNAF 4 section also really perplexes me. It starts with a basic how to play, and then it talks about secret characters, the map, and then it starts a night by night guide. The book also lumps FNAF VR into a 3-page supplement at the back of the book titled Other Games, which is super weird. It does have a full index though, so somebody took their time. Do not buy this. In this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, I'm taking you back to Garten of Banban 3. In the game, we finally see Zolphius as a full-on supporting character, as opposed to a secret character you have to go out of your way to find at the start of the game. I wondered how you could possibly make a character with such a distinctive shape into a plush, and as we've seen from Nab Nab and Boxy, bootleggers somehow managed to do it, and they did it incredibly quickly. This is it. It's a circle with a smiley face on it. You can draw it in like 10 seconds. There is a better one going around, but from the reviews that I've read, if you buy the one with this picture, you get sent the one that I showed before. Do you remember this FNAF book from 2014? I suppose I should start with the obvious. Diary of a Wimpy Freddy is one of the first examples of a FNAF fanfiction that was actually sold and published. It's being sold for actual money like Survive the 5, meaning it's infringing copyright not only on Five Nights at Freddy's, but because it's a parody of Diary of a Wimpy Kid, it's infringing their copyright as well. How the hell did something like this ever get sold? It's funny but also incredibly dangerous. Much like the name, the book itself is wimpy. It's embarrassingly short and the text is unbelievably huge. You can read it from across the room. I don't know why the text is so big. Maybe there was like some kind of threshold they had to reach before they could pump this thing out into every online retailer for years. There is a Wimpy Freddy 2, but it's more of the same, and it's £11. I'm not spending that much. You shouldn't get this book confused with Diary of a Wimpy Foxy, which is way more popular, especially in the early years of the FNAF fandom, and that had 20 million installments. I have no idea which number they're up to now. On this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're going to Norwich. This is a brand new location, and as soon as I arrived, I was greeted with a stall selling Huggy Wuggies, but not like the ones they sold in Cambridge. These ones were absolutely huge. I struck an epic deal, and now it's the jewel in my Huggy collection. I have it here. It's 3 feet high. 3 feet high. Look at that. I've never seen Huggies sold like that before. I heard from a friend at the time that Huggies of this size was the norm in Great Yarmouth. And that got me thinking, maybe I should take the bus down to Great Yarmouth and investigate myself. I'm saving that for another episode. This is big. On this episode we're going to Great Yarmouth, which is where the bootleg equivalent of Atlantis is. In a busy shop in a busy street, I literally fell to my knees and cried when I saw this. Wall-to-wall plushes. Everything in my 100-item AliExpress wishlist was sold on the shelves in waves. There were dozens and dozens of every plush I could hope for. Never in my life have I seen a shop so off-brand as this one in Great Yarmouth. And not only FNAF and Poppy Playtime, although they were the main attraction for me, but also Choo Choo Charles, Bam Bam, Siren Head, Mario. So many recognisable names. I don't know how a shop like this gets away with staying up. This is the highlight of my bootleg adventure so far, by far. This is the most pathetic attempt at trying to avoid copyright on a bootleg product I've ever seen. On this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, I decided to dedicate an entire episode to one single bootleg product I found in Great Yarmouth, and here it is. This is Pokénom. Not Pokemon, Pokénom. And it wasn't even related to the items that they were selling. Obviously, the artwork, font, logo is exactly like Pokemon. I don't know how the hell no one has noticed this yet. In case the name wasn't obvious enough, weirdly it isn't even related to what they were selling. They were like weird watches on tubular boxes and none of them worked. I was hoping that I could get the display box for Pokénom so I could keep it in my room, but they wouldn't let me have it. There was just too much in it. On this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're remaining in Great Yarmouth, but going somewhere brand new. In a different part of the same area, around 3 minutes away from Bootleg Atlantis, which I spoke about in another episode, there's another shop selling bootleg plushes. This time they're mainly funky looking FNAF AR, rest in peace, and FNAF Security Breach plushes. There's also a funny looking Oak Chief from Pikmin 4, which is incredibly odd because at the time that I was there, Pikmin 4 was only 3 days old. I just love how absolutely traumatized Glamrock Freddy looks. And for some reason there's a massive number of high score toy Chica, like sure, that's the one that's most likely to sell, okay. On this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're returning to Cambridge for the first time in months. March 2024 marked 1 year since I began exploring the country looking for bootleg products. At this point it had been about 6 months since I was last in Cambridge, so I was really excited to find out how their stock had changed. Had the shop been shut down? That's what I've been expecting. As it turns out, no, the shop is still open, but their stock had been reduced drastically. The original owner had been deported, and now the shop masquerading as a luggage and phone repair shop was mostly selling luggage. There was still a bootleg section, but they looked like the resistance fighters after a mass bootleg extinction. This poor Huggy even lost its arm. They'd increased a little with the return of some old favourites like Chota Beam, but for the most part, bootleg in the shop was gone. That's the case for toys at least. Look at these scrappy gold Apple watches in broken cling film, I'm sure they're real. On this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we're talking about Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. Once when I was in Great Yarmouth and returning to Bootleg Atlantis that I've spoken about in a previous episode, I found a shelf that was absolutely full of bootleg FNAF figures. In 2021, shortly after Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach came out, this picture circulated and became incredibly popular. It was an image of the bootleg line of figures from the game, which obviously weren't real, and it was ridiculed massively. On this visit, I actually found them all in person, which I was not expecting, and they were all wrapped in incredibly thin plastic. There was also a super odd Glamrock Mangle OC, which I don't even know how to explain, and a shattered Chica that was actually shattered. They were incredibly cheap. I think I actually broke one just holding it in my hands. In this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, I'm taking you back to October and the launch of the amazing Digital Circus. I realised about a week and a half after the pilot for Digital Circus came out that I hadn't seen any bootleg plushes anywhere. I'd seen bags and dinner plates, but no actual toys, and I was wondering why. I decided to return to bootleg hotspot Great Yarmouth to see if there were any Digital Circus plushes to be found. To my surprise, yes! Despite the pilot of Digital Circus being fresh out of the oven, there were dozens and dozens of Digital Circus plushes in Bootleg Atlantis. Bootleggers had already created and exported to England massive amounts of bootleg plushes of Kane, Pomni, Kinger, and all the rest. How do they do it so fast? On this episode of Adventures in Bootleg, we have the finale of Season 1, my very first encounter with a bootleg product in my life. Lego Hero Factory were a line of Lego sets sold between 2010 and 2013, and I absolutely loved them when I was younger. I think I actually had all of them apart from one or two. The set was discontinued in 2014, but I was still a huge fan, so imagine my surprise when half a decade later in 2018, I see Hero Factory figures being sold on shelves under a different name in a spa. Not only that, but I was walking down a market around 5 minutes away from that spa, and I'm not even joking when I say there were over a dozen other Hero Factory sets out there. Earth Tutelary, Space Warrior, Police Force, they were all the same figures but under different names. I've never ever seen a set so bootlegged.